From Kona to Yenan, The Political Memoirs of Koji Ariyoshi. Chapter 2, Depression Years, Work and Education. When I attended Kona High School 20 years ago, a summer trip to Honolulu to work in the pineapple canneries was a great adventure to students. Every summer I worked in the garage department of Hawaiian Pineapple Co., Limited, where a mechanic gave me a start. Without this job I could not have completed high school, for my secondary education depended on my summer earnings. My eldest sister and brother-in-law gave me free board and lodging, and I was thus able to take home to Kona practically all my pay. At the garage I used to observe Manuel Palmer, the superintendent, who frequently worked at the drawing board or went out in the yard to supervise the surveying of the land. I became interested in civil engineering, and about that time I picked that as my life's occupation. But at 17, when I came out of high school, my family was deep in debt to a coffee company and to friends. College education was beyond our means. My elder brother, mother, and I discussed my future, and we came to agreement that once our debts were paid, I could attend university. This took 6 years. I was fortunate in having a childhood friend who was then a student in Honolulu. He sent me books and encouraged and inspired me to read widely. Through his efforts I acquired the reading habit which deepened my curiosity about our country and our people. Reading opened new vistas for me. I read late into the night by lamplight after toiling all day in the coffee field. I read, for instance, the 2 volumes of An American Tragedy 3 times. At first it was incomprehensible to me that such poverty, as described by Theodore Dreiser, could be possible among white families. In Kona, the white families were big ranchers and landlords, and their children went to a private school. We never had contact with them. The biography of Lincoln was inspiring, of Grant, informative, and of Harding, amusing and disgusting because of graft and corruption in his administration. My friend must have read all the books he sent me. The impression they made upon him undoubtedly was different from that made upon me, for he was a son of wealth in our community. His father was a former manager of the coffee company. Our world outlook was different, even at so young an age. The Kona Public Library was 3 miles from my home. I went there occasionally and borrowed books at random. There was no one to give me direction, and no one to discuss what I read. In looking back, I find that the shelves of the one-room library contained mostly light fiction by writers like Zane Grey. During the summer of 1931, the year of my graduation, I returned to the cannery in spite of the opposition of my family. They said I would be jobless in the city and would be dependent on my sister and brother-in-law. The Depression had hit the pineapple industry, and at the cannery we heard that mature pineapples were being destroyed or left unharvested. It seemed inconceivable to me that such a huge fruit factory could be stilled by outside conditions. Footnote: the sale of canned pineapple plunged to catastrophic lows in 1930 to 1931. James Dole was forced out of the company, which was reorganized in 1932. Futch 241-42. Footnote end. I soon became unemployed and learned what depression was like. At that time I wanted to be on my own, therefore I lived in an Aala district hotel with a friend. Every morning I dressed neatly and visited store after store and office after office looking for a job. In the afternoon, I wore soiled clothing and applied for yard work in upper-class residential areas. Sometimes I found a few hours of work. My friend did no better than I. Naturally, there were times when we ate only once a day. On many occasions I became afraid that the depression might crush me both physically and mentally. To idle my time away when I was not looking for a job, I visited pool halls. Life in the slum district was pretty rough and rugged. Because of my background, particularly the strong influence of my mother, I did not become assimilated into that life, although I lived in the midst of it. My friend, who was older than I, had been in California. He had worked in produce markets and on farms as a migratory laborer. Jobs are limited in Hawaii, he said, and as we walked the streets for jobs fruitlessly, he decided to leave for the West Coast. He told me of the numerous opportunities in California. Japanese alien farmers there cannot own land, therefore they would want to go into partnership, even in name only, with Nisei, American-born, first generation. They would list the farm under the citizens' names, get around the discriminatory law, and reward the Nisei partners. Some laws are made for certain people. That is why the rich spend money on lawmakers, he explained. Because I was in no condition to go along with him to California, my friend urged me to apply for federal government positions. One day I applied for a Pearl Harbor apprentice job which was posted in the post office building. A lady asked me whether I was a Chinese and I replied, American. Then she asked me what was my ancestry, and I replied, Japanese. She said she was sorry. I insisted I was a citizen, but that made no difference. When I reported back to my friend, he said indignantly, You mean to tell me we don't have a white man's chance, even with the government? He then explained to me about discrimination against Orientals in California and of the Hearst Yellow Peril propaganda. He blamed the anti-Oriental attitude on the West Coast for the treatment I had just received. but he still wanted to go to California. I could not understand why he should go there. I'd rather starve than get kicked around, I said to him. We're not the only ones. The Mexicans, Jews, and others get kicked around too, he said. This experience brought home sharply to me the cruel lesson of discrimination. When I discussed this matter with older people, some of them said that the strained U.S.-Japanese relationship was responsible. My friend did not agree, and at the A'ala Hotel I listened to arguments. He said that Negroes, Jews, Mexicans, and Filipinos did not have an ancestral country that had strained relations with the U.S., but they were discriminated against. That year in Honolulu was packed full of practical experiences for me. After my friend left for the mainland, a Singer machine salesman took me into his home and gave me board and lodging. I was licked by unemployment, and I said so in a letter to my mother. Then I went to live with my sister and brother-in-law. Shortly after, I learned that Honolulu Dairymen's was employing extras in the ice cream plant. I went there early every morning. Persistence finally won out, and I was employed. Payday a few weeks later, however, was a great disappointment, for my wage rate was far less than what I understood it was going to be. I had put in overtime until 11 p.m. on many days and expected a sizable pay envelope. Another new employee felt just as I did. We talked to the timekeeper who gave us his figures. At that time, Dairymen's was not organized. It was years later that the workers formed a union. As for myself, I had no knowledge of trade unions. The only manner of protest we two could think of was to quit our jobs. We did this after 4 p.m. when the foreman and the executives had gone home for the day. Because we did not work that night, there was a shortage of popsicles and milk nickels the following day. When we went for the balance of our pay the following morning, the manager told us emphatically, "Don't ever show your faces around here again." The ice cream plant workers and delivery truck drivers seemed afraid to talk to us that morning. Such was the fear of the bosses in those days. I felt that even if it were a depression year, the big companies should pay better and provide better working conditions. From Honolulu I went to Pahoa, Puna district on the island of Hawaii, to work in a general merchandise store owned by one of my sisters and her husband. Pahoa is part of the Ola'a plantation. Early in the morning, long before sunrise, I saw men go to work, some of them leading mules that woke up the whole village by the racket they made. In Pahoa, I first saw the depressing plantation housing conditions. I remember delivering groceries to dark, bare and dilapidated shacks, particularly in the Filipino camps. I remember Filipino laborers buying more eggs and energy-giving food during the harvesting season. During Hohana weeding season, they economized on food. The pay then was very small. The housing and sanitation I observed was no better than the slum conditions of the A'ala district. This was my first introduction to the plantation slums, which I was to campaign against years later through the Honolulu Record. Because my brother-in-law played politics, I was able to get WPA, Works Progress Administration, employment on road construction for about 5 hours a day. My brother-in-law was a Democrat, and it took courage then to organize a precinct in a place like Pahoa. Footnote: the Republican Party controlled Hawaii from the time of annexation until 1954. Government jobs of any sort were the major form of patronage. Footnote end. I remember that his Democratic Party activities irritated the Pahoa manager of the sugar company. When there was no WPA money for projects in the Pahoa area, I worked on the road as county maintenance man. Solomon Hoania was our foreman, and he did the employing. I believe he was a Democrat, too, and for that reason he gave me a job in deference to my brother-in-law. After Wall Street went into a tailspin and crashed in 1929 during Herbert Hoover's regime, Franklin D. Roosevelt's government brought some semblance of decency to the begging and starving millions through several federal aid projects. Business had failed, and the administration stepped in to shore up the economy. I was one of the millions who received government aid. Politics was entirely a new thing to me. Because it meant bread and butter to me, I became interested in it. As a WPA worker on a road job, I became more interested in the national administration, which put up project signs everywhere. My experience then was the experience of millions who received progressive education through the pronouncements and activities of the Roosevelt administration. When the NRA signs were put up, we heard that employers had to pay a certain minimum to employees. Footnote: the National Industrial Recovery Act, shortened to NRA, issued an official sign, known as the Blue Eagle, to firms participating in their industry code. Footnote end. Plantation laborers at Pahoa, Puna, where I then lived, were receiving small pay, and those of us who began to work on WPA projects did better than they did. Some young boys out of high school who went to work in the sugarcane fields wanted to work with us, but I believe that the company manager at Pahoa would have frowned upon such a step. It certainly would have brought discontent among the younger elements. Although I did not realize the significance of the plantation housing system then, I noticed that the Portuguese, Filipinos, and Japanese were generally housed separately. I was to learn later that housing was a weapon used by the companies to keep laborers in line and to keep them divided. As a part-time worker in a Pahoa general merchandise store, I delivered groceries to the camps. I found that the Filipino camps were the most dilapidated. The Filipinos were newcomers, compared to the Portuguese and Japanese, and thus were subjected to the worst conditions. At the store, I frequently told the Filipino laborers that they would be afflicted with night eyes if they stringently economized on food during the slack seasons. In Kona, where I was born, we had neighbors who could not see after nightfall. We were told that these people had denied themselves nourishment during their contract labor period on the plantations, scraping and saving on about $10 a month pay in order to return to Japan with some money. The days of indentured servitude of my parents were days of blacksnake whips. Conditions had improved in 3 to 4 decades, but they still were not good. The laborers were no longer bonded slaves or treated as such. They could leave the plantations if they wanted to. I used to tell the Filipinos with whom I became intimate that in Kona we had Japanese neighbors who had 2 names. These men had escaped from sugar plantations during their contract labor days and had taken refuge in the district, which was relatively more isolated. Footnote: penal contract labor ended with annexation in 1900. Footnote end. There, under a new name, they leased and cleared land thickly covered with guava, lantana, and kiu, and planted coffee. After 2 years at Pahoa, I returned to Kona to work for the coffee company which held the mortgage on our farm. With a few boys my age, I pulped and dried coffee down on the beach near Kealakekua Bay. All day long we worked under the sun, naked except for the shorts we wore. We drank gallons of water which flowed out of our pores. When the hard day's labor ended, we jumped into the cool ocean. After supper we visited the Hawaiian village and often heard tales of old Hawaii which were packed full of superstition. We slept in a small room above the pulping machine. The cracks in the plank walls and floor helped the ventilation. Small larvae from coffee berries snapped and twisted on the flooring outside us and came into our room. Bees, centipedes, and scorpions kept us company in bed, and when one of us got stung, we groped in the dark, swearing as we searched for match and lantern. The juicy pulp from the coffee berries rotted below our small shutter window. Large green flies swarmed over the stinking and rotting heap during the day. At night large maggots made millions of snapping sounds that made us imagine that by morning they would have eaten up the whole pile. We were young and rugged and enjoyed the life in a fashion. We cooked canned corned beef with cabbages or onions almost every day and stuffed ourselves with rice. Ketchup was a delicacy and we poured this over our rice. Between bites we chased away stubborn flies and wiped the dripping perspiration. We were paid wages, and in Kona, where farmers were poor and there were almost no openings for jobs besides farm work, we considered ourselves fortunate. One day while I was visiting home, the manager of the coffee company came to see Mother and me. He offered me a job to drive trucks, clerk in his store, and to oversee a section of the mortgaged farms. He proposed that half of my $50 monthly wages go towards paying for our groceries. Mother argued that since our farm was mortgaged and we were getting credit like any other farmer, why should my wages be taken in such a manner? She said that in sharecropping, the food allowance should come out of the farm. We will clear our debt when the coffee price rises, she said. The manager said that we should do everything to pay the farm debt. Mother argued that it was unfair to take my wages to pay the farm debt, which had accumulated because of the slump in the coffee price, overcharge of groceries, household needs, and farm supplies by the company store, and high interest rates. One day I was asked by the manager to talk to one of the farmers who was suspected of selling fertilizer which the company had supplied him on credit. He told me that he had used every bag of fertilizer on his farm, and this I reported back. But I knew as I observed his farm that the amount of fertilizer he had spread under his coffee trees was smaller than what it should have been. On special occasions, farmers' wives asked me for rare delicacies such as canned asparagus or canned fruits which the store did not give on credit to the poorer farmers. There was a Japanese farmer who had many small children, and everyone knew that the company's grocery allowance was insufficient. He frequently asked me to let him buy a few dollars beyond his allowance. Highly embarrassed, he asked me one day to let him have a can of asparagus and a jar of mayonnaise. "It is for my 12-year-old son," he said. "It is for his birthday. He worked so hard during the harvest that I had to promise him something he liked." I wrote his order down in my order book. He smiled and his tears began to flow. He was a father who was able to fulfill his promise. His little children who stood by us stared at their father, who was wiping his tears. Experiences like these made me want to leave Kona. On our farm we were not doing well. I discussed the happenings of the day with Mother, and she always said that people must help each other. As months passed, Brother and I tried to convince Mother that we should quit our farm. she always opposed strenuously. About this time many of the bright and gifted companions of my school days were settling down on their parents' farms, giving up hope of advancing themselves elsewhere. They saw that opportunities were limited. We boys asked Mother to give us the opportunity of finding work outside of Kona. She finally agreed, although the decision to leave the farm must have hurt her deeply. I left for Honolulu, and Mother, with Brother, returned to the plantation environment where she and Father had worked nearly 40 years before. In my youth I generally turned to construction projects when I was looking for a job. Thus, when I came to Honolulu in 1935 I became a construction laborer. I remember shoveling mud for weeks during a rainy season. I was a bricklayer's helper for a while. I drove trucks. Construction work did not provide steady employment. Therefore, whenever I was out of a job I spent my days at the public library. There, in a stumbling manner, I went from the works of one author to another, plodding through their writings with the help of a dictionary. When I worked I was too exhausted to read books, but never too tired to read the Hawaii Hachai, particularly its editorials. I am sure a great many of my generation were influenced by this foreigner of the present Hawaii Herald. It gave us ideas. We thought over issues it discussed. The Hachai was courageous and it championed the common people, and as its publisher, Fred Makino, told me once, it was a paper that fought for the underdogs. In those days the Hachai raised its voice sharply, criticized the Big Five policies, the corrupt politicians, and stepped on the toes of the privileged. Because Makino had led the successful fight against the outlawing of the foreign language schools, I had a great admiration for him. This was more so because my father participated actively in this struggle, and we kept up with developments as the case was fought right up to the United States Supreme Court. The fight Makino carried on wiped out the illusion from the minds of many that the government is always right. To the older generation of Japanese who came here as immigrants, practically worshipping the employer as God and ruler, Makino's constant campaigns and crusades for the people, as against the practices and decisions of constituted authority, were inspiring education and democratic processes. The aliens followed closely. For instance, his defense of Pablo Manlapit when the Filipino lawyer was being deported for his labor activities here. The Hachai was a fighting and crusading paper, and through its fearless policy it inspired courage among its readers. The fact that it carried no Big Five or big business advertising was proof to its readers that it was not controlled by powerful interests. It gave the side that the other big employer-controlled dailies did not print. On the other hand, it forced the dailies to publish items that they would have left out. Progressively, I came to this realization. I can see now that the Hachai gradually opened my eyes by throwing light on events which would have passed me by unnoticed without even raising my curiosity. Since construction work was irregular, the family with which I lived obtained a job for me through a friend at Theo H. Davies & Co. Limited. I became a truck helper and made frequent trips to the docks. At that time my alien Japanese friends advised me to stay on with Davies even as a janitor, they said. There is security in a big firm and opportunities for promotion, I was told. This view was widely held until recently when 5 clerks were laid off, one with 31 years of service. The fact that all were of Japanese ancestry caused bitterness and resentment among some employees. Old-timers I knew at Davies have now organized themselves into a union, after all these years, for protection. When I worked at Davies about 15 years ago, union was an unpopular subject. Most of us were ignorant about this subject. Whatever we read about unions was picked up in the dailies, and looking back, I can see that the articles were unsympathetic, if not hostile to the trade union movement. When I started working at Davies there was a shipping strike, 1936, on the West Coast. The waterfront became a beehive of activity once the strike was over, and I heard longshoremen say there were plenty of jobs on the docks. I left my Davies employment to work as a longshoreman. The regular longshoremen belonged to gangs, and casual employees like me were picked up only when steady gang members did not show up for work. A timekeeper stood on a box at the corner of Queen and West Streets and filled the vacancies in gangs, as foremen went to him with men they had picked from among 200 to 300 men who waited for jobs. A Hawaiian foreman picked me practically every day, since one of his men was sick. The piers were then crowded with ships and we worked from 7 in the morning to 11 at night. Almost every day I worked in the ship's hold and, just like old-timers, I carried a towel with me to wipe away perspiration. We wrung our towels and hung them around our necks, and soon they would drip with perspiration from our heads and faces again. The work was hard, but to me it was extremely exciting. I liked the sound of the grinding winches and the warning call of the operators as the cargo came swinging into the hole. I remember my great satisfaction when a foreman, for whom I had never worked before, picked me on the second day for machine sugar, which was loading sacks of sugar brought to the ship on a conveyor from the warehouse. Machine sugar was considered hard work and dangerous. This was the first time that I had done it, and I was able to perform my work because I had handled sacked material in Kona as a truck driver and coffee mill worker. Some of us who felt that stevedoring was a great adventure took pride in being picked up to fill vacancies in number 1 and star gangs. These were high production gangs which were assigned more skilled work such as heavy lift and cleaner cargoes, while some other gangs handled sacks of cement and such other material. This preferential treatment of gangs was a speed-up technique of the company, but a great many of us didn't see it that way. We competed with each other, between gangs, and exhausted ourselves. My reaction to stevedoring was that of a rugged individualist. Every morning we casual employees waited to be picked up. We wished more regular gang members would be exhausted and stay home so that we would all be hired. We crowded around the foreman, made ourselves conspicuous, and every man was for himself. It was dog-eat-dog competition for a day's work, and this shaped our behavior. A decade and a half ago, when I was a stevedore, a ship foreman checked out individual longshoremen or a gang as he pleased. He knew he would have no repercussions from the unorganized workers. Therefore he demanded bigger sling loads of cargo and yelled from the deck into the ship's hold at perspiring longshoremen, stripped to the waist or wearing only shorts, to speed up the work. Once in a great while a gang would balk and refuse to be pitted against modern machinery. Then the ship foreman barked, "Check out." When we were checked out we expected punishment in the form of less work, and assignments to handle unclean and hard-to-handle cargo. The other gangs on the ship continued working, forced to pile cargo on lift boards as high as the ship foreman demanded. Unlike today, the gangs did not stick together. There was no union to hold them together. Among us workers, union consciousness did not come automatically. The atmosphere was not hospitable to unionization programs. The employer propaganda in the press had poisoned even the minds of workers against unions. The big employers everywhere were fighting the Wagner National Labor Relations Act, which they were to defeat years later during the Truman administration with the Taft-Hartley Law. There was no government educational program to let us workers know that a new law, the Wagner Act, had been passed, which gave us protection we had never enjoyed before. This information was not publicized by the employer-controlled dailies. While working as a stevedore, I wrote a series of articles on the plight of coffee farmers in Kona. I did this when I read in the papers that the legislature was being asked to provide assistance to the distressed farmers. The Star Bulletin published the series, which told of the poverty, the bootlegging of coffee, overcharge by the company stores, and so on. Following this initial writing venture, I did a series on stevedoring. Volunteering to me then was a romantic undertaking, hard labor fit only for a man. This attitude ingenuously flavored the articles. I felt too that the shipping company treated the stevedores comparatively well, a view which I soon learned old-timers on the waterfront did not share. I could not see eye to eye with them. For 6 years I had worked at some of the toughest jobs at small pay. On the waterfront a day's pay, including overtime, was more than half what Davies had paid me for a whole week. At this time I came to know a brilliant young Chinese American who was associated with the YMCA. One day he told me that my articles on Kona coffee farmers were splendid, but he saw no reason why I should glorify stevedore work and praise the company. He asked me if it wasn't the same thing, the coffee farmers being squeezed by the company and the stevedores overworked by the shipping companies. But stevedores are well paid, I said to him. He said I had written that we worked 14 hours a day. That's almost 2 days' work, he said. I had written that we worked 36 hours without sleep, sweating on the docks and in the holds of ships. He remarked that it was no wonder that I received the pay I mentioned. When I said that I was man enough to take it, he was not pleased. He asked me if the old stevedores, in their 50s and 60s, would be able to take the grind day after day. We intensified the speed-up. They became exhausted, and we waited to take their places, actually like vultures picking a man's bones. Discussions with this friend made me see that he was right. The coffee farmers, the plantation workers at Pahoa, and the longshoremen were all struggling for a living. Unorganized, they were pitted one against the other. Those of us who were seeking steady employment competed with the regular stevedores, and in this way we stepped up the competition for their jobs from the outside. New vistas were opened to me through associations like this. I began to have new ideas. On many Sundays I rested from work to attend breakfast gatherings at the YMCA, and there listened to young men of my age discussing local and world problems. All these were entirely new experiences for me. One Sunday Frederick Kamahoahoa was our guest. He was a pioneer of the longshoremen's union here, and we asked him questions after he told us about the fledgling union. I had read a few leaflets on the waterfront, but I had not paid much attention to the union movement. On the job, we worked long hours and we were tired. Close to midnight we rushed home in order to recuperate ourselves for the following day. We were thus kept from getting acquainted with unionism. We knew that some of the longshoremen were union members, but membership was more or less a secret, for it was tacitly understood that this might cause an employee to lose his job. On that Sunday I asked Fred Kamahoahoa numerous questions, and most of them were not sympathetic. He was patient as he explained what a union could do for employees. We had a long session, and Kamahoahoa's answers gave me great satisfaction. It was a great surprise to me that while union activities went on in our midst, many of us had been oblivious to them. On another Sunday, Arnold Wills of the NLRB, National Labor Relations Board, spoke to a larger group and we had a discussion period. These sessions were valuable in giving me an understanding of trade unionism. On the job, I began to take greater interest in the union, and as I talked to longshoremen like Benjamin Kaido or Sam Kohanui, I discovered that they were union members. Both of them were in my gang. A lesson I learned from this period is this, that union consciousness does not come spontaneously. People learn from personal experience and from each other, some faster and others slower. Many learn from others who champion a good cause like unionism, which at the particular moment may be under the sharpest attack from the dominant ruling class. Another lesson I learned is that there is need of patience to explain to people in order to raise their understanding of the problems confronting them. It was a young man close to the YMCA who helped me to appreciate trade unions. Although he was not a worker and I was one, I am ever grateful for the interest he took in me. He helped me acquire, generally, a liberal outlook. Thus today when I hear that certain individuals do not appreciate unions and what their organizations are doing for them, I first raise the question, how well do these people understand unions and what roles they should play to strengthen them and improve their general welfare? The YMCA sessions were a turning point for me, for there I began to think differently of unions. The basic YMCA approach of working together helped me to rub off the rugged individualism. I began to take a greater interest in the union, and not long after that I was asked to join the organization. At that time, membership in the Longshore Union was considered a conspiracy against the shipping company, and I remember wearing the union button inside my cap. Sometimes I pinned it inside my pocket and showed it to longshoremen I wanted to recruit into the union. I learned of the term blacklist after I had joined the International Longshoremen's and Warehousemen's Union. Among union and non-union stevedores, the Big Five's conspiracy to deny work to pro-union men was commonly discussed. The magnified version of this past conspiracy, which was used by employers to intimidate the dock workers, is today's red baiting, political frame-ups, McCarthyism, and loyalty oaths that are used to suppress militancy and independent thinking, deny employment to any nonconformist, and to strike fear into everyone. In the 1930s, a few years after Franklin Delano Roosevelt took office, there was a widespread belief that the New Deal would do away with depression. When I entered the University of Hawaii in 1937, I had such hopes. I felt the starving depression days, when I survived on a bowl of noodles a day in the A'ala district when the going was rough, were over. In 1937, I lived with a family who had helped me in attaining a high school education by finding work for me during the summer months. I had confided to the wife that I wanted very much to continue my education. So one morning in September, she woke me up early and reminded me that the freshmen were taking entrance examinations at the university that week. When the moment came for me to return to the classroom again, I felt old among younger students. The 6 years that I had knocked around had increased my curiosity about various issues and had changed my outlook, and this helped me to enjoy my 2.5 years at the University of Hawaii. I spent some time down on the waterfront, working during weekends and on some weeknights when shipping was busy. During the summer months I worked as a longshoreman. During my freshman year I was fortunate in having a young instructor in English who encouraged reading and tried to teach us how to think. I learned then that the Roosevelt WPA projects on which I worked as a laborer in Pahoa, Puna, had a literary counterpart. New writers with a novel approach, with thinking inspired under the New Deal, were producing proletarian literature. I believe all those who studied under him saw the world in a different perspective, different from what they had seen only a few months before in high schools. There was nothing radical about this instructor. He was intensely interested in making students read and think for themselves. It must have been about the end of my sophomore year that I read in the Hawaii Sentinel, a weekly, that the university regents did not renew the contract of this instructor. The Big Five, which controlled the regents, had a way of blacklisting or getting rid of faculty members who made students think, not only about what they read for their classes, but of local and world problems in association with various books they picked up in the library. I gradually came to this realization when I observed that quite a few instructors and professors restrained themselves from saying in lectures what they knew to be facts. I found that professors whose lectures were dry appeared most sensitive to non-attention. For example, elementary economics was taught by a person whose lecture notes were worn out and faded from years of handling. One day after we had moved into the new social science building, Crawford Hall, the wind blew in from the window behind him and scattered his notes on the floor. The pages became mixed up. Unable to continue without his notes, which he must have used for more than a decade, he dismissed the class. This professor rotated his examination questions from year to year, bringing them back in a cycle, so that all any enterprising student had to do was buy the collected set of his questions from former students and study them to make the passing grade. Elementary psychology examinations were handled in the same manner. The examinations were a farce, with honest students who devoted their time to reading the assignments and taking lecture notes, often making the poorer grades. The New Deal was something which students taking elementary economics wanted to know about and would have been interested in. The professor almost never touched on it. Those who had borrowed lecture notes from students who had taken his course waited for him to crack his jokes, which came at the precise moment and in the same words that he had uttered the year before and in years before that. A large number of students laughed at the exact timing of the jokes which were written in the professor's notebook. A course in American literature made me see how writings of a given period reflected the social conditions of the time. Thus, writings of Emerson, Melville, Tom Paine, Dreiser, and Steinbeck came to have more meaning for me. At that time the social, political, and intellectual climate were hospitable to books like John Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath or In Dubious Battle. While at the university, I took part annually in raising funds for students in China who were moving inland because of Japanese imperialist aggression. I remember writing a column in Ka Leo, the university newspaper, asking support of the fund drive. In the Oriental Institute Library I read of the conditions under which Chinese students studied. There was a description of a place named Yenan in the northwest hinterland of the vast country. Students were studying in caves, I read. I included this information in my column. I did not know that about 5 years later I would live in one of those caves in Yenan as a United States Army G2 personnel. After I had completed 2.5 years at the University of Hawaii and again returned to stevedoring, I found many contradictions between what I had heard in classroom lectures and what I heard from speakers at A'ala Park, a place for down-to-earth education during the late 30s in Honolulu. As I walked home from the docks where I worked to the streetcar stop, there were many evenings when voices of labor organizers and politicians came booming over the loudspeaker from the A'ala Park bandstand. I was drawn to the gathering and I listened to what the speakers said. I began looking forward to these rallies, where men with courage stood up and exposed the monopoly-controlled system in the territory. The audience was comprised almost entirely of workers. The speakers were down to earth and it was not difficult to follow what they said, but to understand all they said was another matter. At the rallies, the speakers were pro-labor or workers themselves. At the university, a liberal professor was exceptional. Some lecturers tried to put on a front that they were not prejudiced against laborers and that they were fair. Pro-labor speakers at A'ala Park like Willie Crozier and his brother Clarence awakened and raised the social understanding of those who listened to them. I recall that when Willie Crozier left the Democratic Party because, he said, it was controlled by Republicans and the Big Five, he spoke frequently at A'ala Park on the independent nonpartisan party platform. This took place during 1936 and 1938. His exposure and blasting of the vested interests here sowed seeds for thought throughout the territory. One of the main planks of the party was the right to collective bargaining, more or less accepted by the big Hawaiian employers today but booted around by them in the middle and late 30s. At the university, a professor in elementary economics used to say that labor had the right to collective bargaining. However, he almost always had his but. Another remark we students heard was if only laborers and their leaders were responsible, such qualifications were not applied to employers or their conduct. I do not know how many students readily fell for this prejudice line, but repetitions of such remarks undoubtedly left impressions. Most of the students came from working-class families on the plantations, in towns, and in Honolulu, but the professor lectured to them as though laborers who were trying to organize were a different type of workers from the students' parents. Here again, I do not know how many students felt they were disassociated from the working class. But I recall that students did not question anti-labor remarks in classrooms, remarks which actually criticized or ridiculed their own social class. I heard of the Bloody Monday shooting of laborers and their supporters at the Hilo docks in 1938 from speakers at A'ala Park. The Big Island policemen were used by the big interests to shoot demonstrators who protested the scabman Wai'ale'ale. We could and should have drawn lessons from this incident in the university classrooms. But I did not hear a single instructor or professor remark about this in the classroom. In private, one of them discussed it with me, and I was grateful to him then for giving me a deeper understanding of the strike situation. I believe there were others among the faculty members who felt outraged at the Bloody Monday shooting, where more than 50 were wounded, but they carefully avoided comment to their classes in order to keep their jobs. The control of the university by Hawaii's vested interests is such that independent-minded, open, and courageous faculty members have no guarantee of continued employment. Teachers who make students think become unpopular with the Board of Regents. Thus, the instructor who taught me freshman English was released. In like manner, a man like Dr. John Rienecki, who took great interest in the fledgling labor movement and who refused to be thought-controlled, could not obtain continued tenure at the Manoa campus. I came to know Mrs. Eiko Rienecki in an American literature class. I found that the Rieneckis had deep sympathy for the workers and their struggle to better their livelihood. When I then received a YMCA scholarship to study in Georgia shortly after I came to know them, I wished that I had met them sooner. I felt that perhaps they could have helped me to understand the various questions that came into my mind, pertaining to depression, war, unemployment, land monopoly, labor organizations, classes in society, and social and economic discrimination, subjects that the Crozier brothers had frequently blasted at their Alla Park appearances. What are the answers, the solutions to these ills in society, the motivations of human conduct? Like a jigsaw puzzle, scattered bits of information filled my mind. I could not piece them together into a consistent whole. I could not understand the whole panorama of social life, with all its struggles and uneven development. I could not understand why things happened as they did or why people behaved as they did. During my second year at the university, I had become intimate with a Japanese-American graduate student. His home was in Hamakua, on the island of Hawaii. He was brilliant and made straight A's without much difficulty. He expressed the opinion frequently that people of Oriental extraction did not receive equal opportunities here. He seemed bitter against discrimination. When he worked in a bookstore in town, he spoke of the double standard of treatment of white and non-white employees. One day he asked me to look at his face carefully. "Do you see any difference in my right and left sides?" he asked. I did not see any distinguishing features. "One of these days you will," he said. "I was operated on and a doctor accidentally cut a nerve. Part of my face is paralyzed and it will not age. The other side will." "Did you sue the doctor?" I asked. "How can I? He is an influential Haole doctor. He gave me a couple of $100 and that was all," he said. "This friend of mine wanted to go to Japan. One of my classmates was thinking of going there also. They explained that there would be no discrimination. You'll get drafted into the army and sent to China," I told my friend. "But the war won't last forever," he said. "I'm going anyway." I saw him leave on a ship during the summer of 1940. I told him he should hurry back if he felt that there would be war between the US and Japan. He said he could get ahead in Japan. He would not stay here to fight discrimination and improve conditions. A few weeks after his departure, I sailed for the West Coast, then traveled to Georgia. My activities had brought me close to a YMCA secretary who encouraged me to study on the mainland. Through him I received a scholarship. We chose Georgia. By then I was deeply interested in the South. I had read some writings of Erskine Caldwell. I had become interested in the Negro people. I wanted to major either in sociology or journalism. The YMCA secretary and others suggested that I keep in close touch with them because war with Japan seemed only a matter of time.